Welcome to Chapter 16, Socializing and Educating Staff for Team Building. When we think about learning organizations, we really do understand that learning organizations create an environment where collective learning is encouraged, mistakes are expected and seen as opportunities to learn, and all of these, the learning and the mistakes and the process of learning, result in transformational change. There's a model that does a nice job of explaining what a learning organization should include. Sing's model of learning organizations has 5 disciplines. The first is systems thinking. This encourages staff to see themselves as connected to the whole organization, and work activities are seen as having an impact beyond the individual. The second discipline is personal mastery. Each member of the staff is committed to improve his or her personal abilities. The third discipline is team learning. It is through the collaboration of team members that learning organizations achieve their goals. The fourth discipline is mental models. This holds that the assumptions by the individuals can be challenged because they release individuals from traditional thinking and promote the full potential of individuals to learn. It lets them think outside the box. Shared vision is the final discipline. Members share a common vision. They're more than willing to put their personal goals and needs aside and instead focus on teamwork and collaboration. So with systems thinking, having everyone work together, personal mastery, everyone being at their best, team learning, collaborating with team members to learn, a mental model that allows people to think outside the box and look beyond the status quo and understanding, and then having a shared vision and common goals allow learning organizations truly to have transformational change. I'd like you to be aware of the difference between training and education. Training can be defined as an organizational method of ensuring that people have knowledge and skills for a specific purpose and that they have acquired the necessary knowledge to perform a duty or a job. Education is more formal and broader in scope than training. Whereas training has an immediate use, education is designed to develop individuals in a broader sense. When we look at the purpose of these, we look for competency, to meet new learning needs and to satisfy an interest. I'd like to remind you that competency is defined as having the ability to meet the requirements for a particular role. When we think about education and how it's presented in a corporate environment, very often there's an education department. You should know that education personnel do not have authority over those that they educate. They have the responsibility to share information, hold people accountable for educational outcomes from an academic standpoint, but they cannot, there's no discipline enforced if they are not compliant with education. That goes back to a unit manager or the person in a formal leadership role. Learning theories and teaching strategies are important. The next slide is going to cover pedagogy and andragogy. So we'll skip those at the moment. Social learning theory, and I think your book touches on a few other theories. Social learning theory, the basic idea behind that is that we learn from doing within a social environment. And I think your book touches on some teaching strategies. I want you to know that there's variations about there. The primary ones I want you to focus on are pedagogy and andragogy. I'd like you to be able to discern the difference between how we approach an education model with our young adults. When we think about our infants up to late adolescence and high school, and then we start to see the drift into an andragogical approach of adult learning as students begin to enter into a college setting. Now, there's often a bridge period of transitioning from how do I learn how did I learn as an adolescent in high school to how I should be learning as an adult? Typically, we see people that have integrated education into a full-time career path and adult roles like parenting and marriage, and you really are fully into an adult role when we think about the evolution of andragogical learning styles. We think about the adult learner, we're often thinking about the learner who has a complex life pattern. We're not typically looking at the 18, 19-year-olds, although, there's always an outlier in a group. Lessons that we get from Knowles, who developed these learning theories, is that a climate of openness and respect will assist identification in what an adult learner wants and learns. Our adult learners like taking part in the planning of their education. They want to be involved in the evaluation of that education. Experiential teaching techniques work well with our adult learners. Adult learners do not face mistakes in their educational process as endings. They see them as life opportunities to learn and develop and to improve. If the value of the adult learner's experience is rejected, the adult learner is going to feel rejected. So if they're experiencing something and they have a negative experience with it, they're going to personalize that in a very individual manner. It's important for adults to be able to apply what they have learned very quickly to their life meaning. And it's important as a nurse leader within a hospital organization to understand that you could be cross-secting in your staff faculty or your floor staff the challenges of having some very young learners who may be in their late adolescence, early 20s, who are still very accustomed to learning at a pedagogical approach where they really do want passive learning activities. They want to be told what they need to know so they can move to the next step. Whereas you have other people within the same work environment who have an andragogical approach, who want to know, what does this education mean to me? How does it become meaningful? How is it useful? And really want more than just the facts. They want application. So as a nurse leader, you need to be able to understand who your population is. So when you plan education and you plan the strategy you'll use, you're respectful of that learning, those learners' preferences. Obstacles and assets to adult learning. I think these are pretty straightforward. I'm going to let you review these on your own. Social learning theory, I mentioned a few moments ago, that it explores 4 processes, really looking at people learn as a result of a direct experience, learning is vicarious, people learn by judgment voiced by others, people evaluate the soundness of new information by reasoning through inductive and deductive reasoning. And all of this happens with the influence of the social environment through peer groups. Again, this comes back to, if we think about it from a leadership standpoint, how do you use social learning in a group setting? Perhaps you decide to use a professional journal club to increase scholarly activity within your team. How do you use the social aspect of sitting together and maybe having lunch while you go through an article to really influence the outcome of that learning from that article? And we can use social learning theory to influence that. These are some examples of other learning theories I want you to go through and just have a general understanding of them. Chunking is a concept that is not well understood. The idea behind chunking is that you use the chunking method to present a collection of common ideas and allow the students to take pieces of information one bite at a time. Think about your med-surg course where chunking information would be, if you want it, sterile technique. You would start with the steps that were required for preparing your hands and hand washing before you even donned your gloves. So you'd practice the steps of hand washing before you practice the steps of donning sterile gloves in a sterile technique manner. So you'd put common pieces of information together and then build them onto other pieces of information until you had a whole section of learning. The development of educational programs is vital for a learning organization to have intentional planning for their education. They need to understand, first and foremost, what knowledge or skill is needed at the time that the education is being evaluated. They need to identify the level of interest. I can want all of my staff to understand how to use evidence-based practice at the bedside. But if none of my staff has any interest in understanding the value of research and how it informs your practice, They can need it all day long, but if there's no level of interest, then you have a problem that you need to address before you move forward. So if you have something you feel is needed and there's a minimum level of interest, you need to do some activities to increase the level of interest. You need to identify present levels of knowledge and interest of the learners. You need to identify resources available to meet the needs. And then you need to evaluate and test the outcomes. What's the learner's reaction? What change in behavior are you expecting? Organizational impact. How does the learning impact the organization as a whole? And then look at cost effectiveness. Was it worth the financial investment that I made for this education to receive the organizational impact that I had? It is important to remember that when we're facilitating evidence-based practice, that it's a shared responsibility of the professional nurse, organizations, the leaders and managers, and the education staff. When we approach an educational program, it is so important that that program has the underpinning of good education, of good evidence, and good research to support the value of the education and the strategies used in implementing the educational program. Strategies for promoting evidence-based practice. I think these are pretty straightforward. I'm going to let you run through them. Socializing and resocializing. Socializing, it's also considered enculturation, and it involves the sharing of values and attitudes of an organization. So let's say you are a new nurse in a couple of weeks and you start your new job. One of the first things you're going to do is you're going to socialize to that role. You're going to learn about your organization's values, attributes, attitudes. You're going to learn about their culture and their background. Why did the organization start? What's its mission in the community? You're going to learn about all those things. And you're going to hopefully buy into them. You're going to personalize those values, and you're going to ask yourself, how do I support my organization's values and goals and missions? Resocialization occurs when individuals are forced to learn new values, skills, attitudes, and social rules as a result of change to the type of work they do. Think about if you have worked in a small community hospital and you've been there for 10 years, and a local healthcare system realizes that the small community hospital needs resources and support, so they buy the small hospital and they bring them into a community of other small hospitals. The way that small hospital worked as an independent hospital in a small community is suddenly shifted. All of a sudden, the way it used to be is no longer that way, and everyone in that small community hospital has to re-socialize based on a change to become adopted into the new culture. The transition point for many folks when they are in the process of an organizational change, many become frustrated because they struggle with the resocialization process, and many people who can't make those adjustments either voluntarily leave or removed from the organization because they no longer fit. And normally it becomes performance and behavioral issues when they become known to the organization as not being resocialized as appropriate. This is where the concept of the queen bee, or the person who is unwilling to teach others and doesn't want others to succeed, doesn't allow the people that are coming behind the queen bee to be successful. If you have a queen bee in your culture, they can be very, very detrimental to the socialization or the resocialization of an organization. A professionally healthy, well-adjusted preceptor or mentor will recognize that there are queen bees in the organization, call attention to those people, hopefully encourage a change in behavior. But if at a minimum, new employees, whether through a socialization or a resocialization process, should be protected. Social bees can be very negative in preventing healthy transitions from occurring. During times of change, their roles can change as well. So organizations, we think about socialization. Organizations can fail to address the socialization problems that occur in job positions or status changes. So think about someone who has, again, been in that small community hospital and perhaps was a chief nursing officer and managed everything across the board within that small community. They come under the umbrella of a larger healthcare organization, and suddenly they don't manage their own staffing. There's a department for that. Their budget is now being supervised by a different financial advisor, whereas they had pretty good control over it. All of those things happen. So during organizational change, when there's a role change that accompanies it, that goes back to resocialization. That requires a nurse leader to be very aware of vulnerable people that are caught up in change, that are having their roles changed, to help support them through that process. Role overload occurs when the demands of the roles are excessive. Typically, that is from ineffective leadership relates to that. And during role change, we need to remember to encourage nurses who are going through a role change to network and stay connected within a peer group in the organization so that they can find support and meaning in the change, and they can transition from the way it used to be to the way it is now. As a population, you all are getting ready to go through your own transition. Marlene Kramer came up with Reality Shock. It was 1974 when she wrote this book that does a beautiful job of explaining how new nurses transition from their educational environment into the work environment. The honeymoon period is considered to be the first 3 to 4 months of practice. And this is when you're excited. You are in orientation, you're being closely supervised, you're being nurtured, people are pouring into you and giving you feedback. You are pretty much on day shift or night shift, whichever the one you were hired to work on. Things feel good. You're getting paid. Most people are very excited about getting their first paycheck as a nurse, and you start to feel like you're getting your groove. Shock happens typically between that 3 to 6 month period when you're off orientation. You begin to pick up the full patient load. You begin to have things that are shifting in your environment. Maybe you were hired for day shift, but then you have to work some nights. It could be that you, because of short staffing, all of a sudden you're working every other weekend when you were told you were only going to be working 1 weekend a month. People are going to be less protective of you from a peer standpoint. You may be dealing with people who aren't as willing to help as they were when you were in your orientation period. They're not as friendly. When you ask questions, you get eye rolls, or they ignore you or act like they don't hear you. You begin to feel kind of like a ship without your sails. This is a very stressful time. This is a key time that nurse leaders need to be closely monitoring new nurses. This is the time that they need to role model, mentor, and add additional support to get these new nurses through this shock period. The shock period transitions into recovery, and recovery normally happens with the firm support of a leader. 6 to 9 months where you start to realize that things aren't perfect, but they're okay. You catch your breath. You feel like, okay, I can work a few more nights than I thought I was going to. It isn't, people aren't as friendly as I thought they were going to be, but I found a good group of people that are friendly enough, and I feel safer now. It's kind of that you realize that you're going to be okay. In this period of recovery, if you're doing one of two things, you're either getting your feet back under you and feeling more stable and you re-engage in the socialization of your role, or you begin to look for another job. We know, depending on the research you look at, between 25 and 45% of all new nurses leave their first position before the year is up. 25% leave nursing entirely in their first year of nursing. So we have a real failure in that shock to recovery phase of retaining those new nurses. Restitution is the phase, normally 9 months to a year, where you are in a balance, you are feeling good about things, you've gotten into your stride, and you're beginning to engage in your own culture. You're willing to sit on committees, you're aware of what shared governance is, and you're supporting a committee in some way. You are reinvesting. You're all in. And that period, and the time frames I wouldn't worry about the precision of that because it's individual to the person. What I want you to do is to be thinking critically about the transition from one phase to another and how that will feel to that new nurse as they're going through it. I'd like you to be able to discern the difference between a role model, a preceptor, and a mentor, especially as they relate to team building. Role models are vicarious. They tend to be people in the environment that other nurses feel represent nursing well. They have experience, they're competent, they're seen as approachable. They may not have a relationship with the person that they're role modeling with, but they are viewed as someone that's worth emulating. Preceptors are assigned. They are active and purposeful. They are often an experienced nurse who provides emotional support, strong clinical skill role modeling, and close supervision. Mentors are typically chosen. This allows for an in-depth supportive and nurturing relationship between an expert and a novice. It's a formal relationship that's typically lasts 2 to 5 years, and it allows the mentor to support and nurture the new nurse in a way that is, while it is an agreement between two, it isn't assigned by an organization like a preceptor. You are not likely to choose who's going to precept you in your skill development. Your mentor is someone that you're going to actively seek and choose. I'm going to encourage you to find a nursing mentor. Within your first 3 to 4 months of practice, especially during that honeymoon phase, think critically about the nurses who you've come in contact with. Who presents themselves as a good role model that you see being really good to patients, who has a good relationship with the other professionals on the healthcare team? Who do you think has it all going in the right direction? And seek them out and say, I need a mentor. I need someone that I can bounce ideas off of, that I can ask questions to, that I feel safe talking to, and that I trust. Mentors are personally chosen, and it's important, and I'm going to encourage you to make that effort very soon to find a mentor once you're hired. Sanctions are a way of bestowing rewards or punishment. It is good to understand that while we think of sanctions with a negative connotation, it isn't intended to be negative. You can use a sanction to reward someone as well as to punish them. It's important to use sanctions to motivate, to motivate your team, and that any motivation should not be destructive. I want you to think about appropriate and inappropriate sanctions. What do they look like? What have you seen used in a work environment that has encouraged good compliance with policies and procedures, good patient outcomes, good teamwork, good communication? What kinds of sanctions were used or introduced into your work environment that were favorable? What kinds of negative sanctions were used that when things weren't done well were implemented to help retrain or bring up to speed an employee who wasn't where they needed to be? But was that punishment or negative sanction destructive? It's okay for it to be a little uncomfortable, but it should not destroy the person's individual identity and should not shame them. Coaching is a manager role, and I do want you to be mindful that the outcome of coaching, the goal of coaching, is to help the individual perform at their optimum level. You want your employees to be at their best. Coaching should not occur once a year. It should be a frequent opportunity for a manager to help grow their employees. Meeting the educational needs of a culturally diverse staff require that we respect the cultural diversity and recognize its desirability. We know that a multicultural nursing staff is better able to provide multicultural nursing care, that we are more sensitized to the cultural needs of our population if we are more diverse. So I do want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about the unique needs of diverse staff who may come from us with a variety of backgrounds, and that first and foremost that we are respectful, we're welcoming, and we encourage their enculturation into our hospital organization. That will help them feel a part of the team. It also will improve their educational outcomes as they learn how to provide nursing care using our policies and procedures in a respectful, culturally competent environment.